and welcome to Over the Binary, the official podcast of Gender Wellness of Los Angeles. My name is Grace O'Connor. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I use she, her pronouns.
And I'm Casey Weitzman, she, her, and the president and founder of Gender Wellness of Los Angeles for the past 30 years. It's been my mission to normalize being transgender and gender diverse. In my practice, I enjoy working with transgender youth and their families, as well as adults and allies. And together at Gender Wellness, we provide support groups, monthly blogs and podcasts, and other services that we'll talk about as we go through today.
Great. Yes, we will. And today we're going to be talking about the connection of autism diagnoses among the gender diverse population. Just a few stats to get us started. According to studies, and for reasons not completely understood, maybe we'll understand a little bit more today, gender diverse people are 3 to 6 times as likely to be on the autism spectrum as cisgender people. Nearly 70% of autistic gender diverse adolescents say they need medical gender related care. And 32% say their gender identity has been questioned because of their autism diagnosis, which must be very, very traumatizing. And with that said, we'd like to welcome our very special guest today, Dr. Laurie Stephens. Dr. Stephens is a developmental psychologist who has been working with children, teens, and young adults on the autism spectrum for over 25 years. She currently serves as the Help Group's Senior Director of Autism and LGBTQ plus programs. Previously, Dr. Stephens serves as the Director of Clinical Services for Education Spectrum for over 12 years. So welcome, Laurie Stephens.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation.
It's great to have you here. So maybe we can start a little, maybe at the beginning. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your organization, about the Help Group and Kaleidoscope LGBTQ and why they were formed.
Sure. Well, the Help Group has been around since about 1975, and it's a large nonprofit agency that runs a variety of non-public schools, so schools for neurodiverse children and children with emotional and trauma backgrounds. And then we also have clinical programs, so we have an outpatient service, mental health services, and a lot of programs for underserved children. And as a clinician myself, what had happened is I come from the autism world and have been working with autistic clients for about the past 30 years. And I started to notice in my practice that more and more of my clients were coming out to me as gender diverse, non-binary, transgender. And I started to think, this seems like it's a higher proportion than I would have expected. And at the same time, in the Help Group schools, they were seeing an increase of LGBTQIA identities and a need for more GSAs and more affirming supports, which I think had never really been thought about in the special needs populations. So I think people kind of thought, well, you have special needs, you can't also be LGBTQIA, or you don't really understand what it means. And so I started to think this is something we need to investigate, this overlap between autism and gender diversity. And at the same time, the schools were saying we need to have more understanding, awareness, and programming for our LGBTQIA students. And thus Kaleidoscope was born. Kaleidoscope was started in 2018. So it's a relatively new program because unfortunately we got hit by COVID about a year and a half into us really getting our feet going. But at Kaleidoscope, we provide mental health services. So we provide individual therapy, family support, family training, and group therapy. And then we also run a lot of social supports. So we might have interest clubs. We have like a young adult coffee clutch where they meet at a coffee shop on a monthly basis. And, the young adults kind of guide that. And we do a lot of training on the overlap, particularly for therapists and in schools, so that people really become aware of the fact that if you work with the autistic population, you really need to understand the gender diverse population. And if you work in the gender diverse world, you really need to understand autism.
Well, you sure do. And by the
Great.
way, Casey and I love Kaleidoscope LGBTQ.
Thank you.
We send so many of our clients there. Y'all are so well known in the community. And it's such a
Great.
great thing that you provide services to neurodivergent and LGBTQ youth, which is such a need.
Correct.
And I was going to say, we got to you through Jerry Rothman.
Mhm.
So that's
I
wonderful.
mean, this is obviously a very difficult time. The fact that we have to have, or there continues to be a need to hold the Transgender Day of Remembrance, and most of the celebrations involve reading a list of all the transgender people who were murdered simply for being who they are. And, it's 2023, and we're all hoping for the day that we don't have any names to read at all, and people just come to accept that you are who you are and you're a fantastic person.
Yeah. And by the way, just to kind of add on to that, we're in Southern California, and West Hollywood is a wonderful LGBTQ affirming city. And, they have their annual event, and they are having their Transgender Day of Remembrance in WeHo on Monday from 6 to 9 p.m. At the West Hollywood City Council Chambers, which is at 625 North San Vicente Boulevard. It's an amazing event. I've gone to it. I'll be there Monday night, and we'll be doing more honoring of those who have, experienced violence due to their transgender and non-binary existence. If you want more information on that, go to www.weho.org/#calendar.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So, Laurie, could you describe for our audience what autism is, and for clarity, touch on some of the terms which may come up today, like neurodiverse, neurotypical, autism spectrum disorder, gender diversity. We think you would be the perfect person to try and make some sense for us and our audience.
Sure. I'm not sure if I'll remember all of the terms that we might
Okay.
use, but certainly I will attempt to clarify them as I use them also, in case I don't get to them. The concept of neurodiversity, because I think it's easiest to start with the broadest concept and then we can work our way down to some specifics. But neurodiversity is simply the notion that brains form differently, right? So neuro kind of implies brain and diversity implies difference. And for a long time, there's been this idea that everybody kind of has the same brain. We all think the same, we all act the same, we all react to the same. And that certain people who had unusual reactions, that they were different, and that it was seen sort of as a bad thing. And so the neurodiversity movement is here to kind of say, you know what, there really is no such thing as a neurotypical brain. That's kind of what people have been using as the opposite phrase, is neurotypical. But I mean, between the three of us, we might not be identified as autistic, or neurodiverse, but our brains are not exactly the same. We don't all think the same. We don't all have the same reactions to things. We have different strengths and different weaknesses. I'm horrible at math. One of you might be great at math, but that doesn't make either one of us so there's no such thing as neurotypicality. We need to really think about everybody as kind of being neurodiverse and understanding that there's subsets within that neurodiversity. So having experienced childhood trauma can actually lead to your brain kind of wiring itself in a different way. So you could consider traumatized children and young adults and adults as being neurodiverse. A learning disability is a neurodiversity. So when we look at it, having obsessive compulsive disorder, being anxious, being depressed, they're all neurodiversities. We know that all of these things are caused by what's going on in our brains, in addition to what's going on in our thinking patterns. So autism is a form of a neurodiversity. And in previous years, autism has really been stigmatized and thought of as something that isn't a good thing, and people shouldn't be autistic, and you can't act that way, and you can't do this, and you need to just conform. And people really thought that you could be a little bit autistic or you could be a lot autistic, and none of this is actually true. So autism is simply defined by a kind of constellation of symptoms that include having some communication difficulties, and it's mostly social communication. So you might have challenges in holding a conversation, You might have challenges in understanding some of the give and take of kind of pragmatic language, reciprocity. You will have a limited behavioral repertoire, which means that you might want to, I don't know, talk about the same thing over and over again, or you might have very limited interests. You might enjoy doing repetitive actions or repetitive behaviors. And then there's also sensory sensitivities, which means that many people with autism, but also people without autism, will have an oversensitivity to lights, to sounds, to tastes, to texture. So they might not like the feel of certain clothing. They might not like long sleeves. They might not like their hair being brushed. They might not be able to handle being in certain environmental situations because they can be too loud, too crowded. And so when you see somebody with that constellation of symptoms, along with some other things, that's what qualifies somebody as being autistic. But it isn't like you can be more or less autistic. It's that your constellation of symptoms might cluster primarily in one area, whereas somebody else, their constellation of symptoms might be much more broad. So perhaps you have some challenges in every one of the areas that we look at in terms of autism. And so, but that doesn't make you, it's not a linear way of thinking about autism. It really is this multi-dimensional concept. So that's kind of what autism is in a 10-second, or that probably was more than 10 seconds.
Yeah, that's the elevator pitch. We appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that. Do you have any questions or comments, Grace? Or
Yeah, one thing maybe we can talk, one thing comment I can make rather is I read a little article from Harvard Health, and they define neurodiversity as the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. There is no one right way of thinking and behaving, and differences are not to be viewed as deficits. So I guess what I'm wondering, Laurie, it sounds like we're kind of moving away from pathologizing neurodiversity. It's becoming more, less pathologizing.
Absolutely. I think there's many articles now that are coming out that really highlight the benefits of being neurodiverse. And we are absolutely working toward reducing the pathology or the pathological thinking in regard to autism, but in regard to a lot of other types of diagnoses, if you will, also. I know there's many autistic advocates who think that autism shouldn't really even be considered a mental health, which it is. It's classified in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as a mental health disorder. But really, if we think about it, neurodiversity is kind of the same thing, sort of like biodiversity, right? Biodiversity is good. We want things to grow in different ways, and the differences are what makes a lot of our environment grow and continue to expand. And the same thing if you're trying to create new programs or new ideas and you put 5 people in the room who think exactly the same way, you're not going to get very far. You put 5 people who see the world and view the problem from different angles together in the room, and you're going to get pretty amazing solutions. So in that case, neurodiversity needs to be celebrated and needs to be seen as a positive and a benefit. And we need to, and I'll speak specifically for autism, we need to stop thinking that autistic people are broken, that autistic people need to act normal, because there's no such thing as normal, right? That meme, normal is just a setting on the washing machine. We need to really embrace that, and we need to do all that we can to be advocating out there for the rights of autistic people to be autistic. It's okay. That's just who they are. They want to rock, and it's okay. And, I work with teachers all the time, and I work with parents, and with always saying we all stim, right? That idea of rocking or flapping your hands. Everybody does it. We just do things that maybe aren't as noticeable. So I tend to play with my hair. I play with my rings all the time. It's the same thing as this person who rocks. If I'm allowed to do it, why isn't an autistic person allowed to do it?
Well, it's really quite refreshing what you're saying because, obviously we're probably all around the same age, but even just growing up as young kids, the last thing you really wanted to be or was to be autistic or to have a friend because for me, it was like there's something odd or weird about them. They need more help.
Mhm.
So I think this talk is so refreshing to normalize it. As we're seeing it, I even have kids now that want to have their parents understand I'm neurodiverse, I'm different.
Mhm.
And I think, I don't know if we'll get to that question, but I do want to spend just a couple minutes, and we can do it now or later. How do we test for it? Like, since it is a diagnosis still, does someone come to the help group or Kaleidoscope and get tested? I mean, can we send clients there, or how does that work in getting that initial, I don't want to say diagnosis, but at least
Assessment, maybe?
assess?
Yeah. The thing is that we still need to call it a diagnosis because that's kind of the only way oftentimes that people will be able to get services and to get the help that they need, because insurance is medical diagnosis driven, and medical including mental health in this case. So in order for them to get reimbursed, let's say by insurance or something like that, they will need the actual diagnostic
Okay.
code of autism spectrum disorder. And yes, the Kaleidoscope, and actually through our mental health program, which is called Lumina Counseling. So there's a lot of names of the help group. But Lumina Counseling, we do diagnostic evaluations. We have a specialty clinic even, and I know we'll start to talk a little bit more about that overlap between autism and gender diversity, but we also have a specialty clinic for gender diverse folk to come in. Many of them oftentimes are questioning whether they do have autism. And so we're like a neurodiverse informed, but also gender diverse informed a group. And so we kind of know what to look for. And we do diagnostic evaluations for anybody who suspects that they might have autism. They don't have to be gender diverse, but we do have a specialty clinic and a fully informed and affirming clinic for that.
And that's good, because I think in the community that we work with, it's kind of the same thing. We don't want to pathologize being transgender or non-binary, but if you want insurance to cover it or cover any of the surgeries, you have to put at least gender dysphoria as a diagnosis. So it's almost like, it kind of feels like the worlds are kind of similar. To get services and get reimbursed, you still have to have a mental health, a diagnosis. So that's good to know that.
Yeah, I feel like the diagnosis can be a good guide too, to kind of help develop a treatment plan. I think in that way, of course, they need it for insurance, but it's also being able to look at the symptomology and be able to kind of formulate a treatment plan that's affirming. And, I love that we're moving away from the medical model in so many different fields, right? I mean,
Right.
the transgender non-binary community for the longest time, you know, the medical model was the only way to go. I mean,
Right.
Casey could tell you stories about, folks who have been in this working with the trans and non-binary population for as long as she has, and as long as you have, about, a panel of therapists okaying letters for transgender clients, right?
Right. The whole gatekeeping and the whole notion that everybody had to be gender dysphoric, where that hasn't always happened. Many people actually experience genderphoria, euphoria, when they get to dress how they want to and have any type of gender affirming interactions. So it was kind of there's so many parallels. It's interesting that the two identities do overlap the way that they do, because there's a lot of similar history, including autistic young women used to be sterilized because it was like, well, you can't possibly and should not be allowed to have children, and people were making horrible decisions And there's a very long history of uh, pretty intense behavioral treatments that people, autistic people, are now able to talk about the trauma that they experienced as a 4, 5, and 6-year-old, being told that everything that came naturally to them was wrong, and that they had to sit like little robots and always make eye contact. And we could talk about eye contact forever, because it's something that drives me crazy, this whole idea of forcing somebody to make
Look
eye
at
contact.
me. Yeah, look at me when I'm talking to you.
Cannot, I look at me as one of my least favorite. It's like, why? They don't, why? And like when a teacher says, look at me, when they're giving a homework assignment, it's like, but
Right.
actually, that's not the reason why people make eye contact. They don't make eye contact so they can remember. Lots of people remember better when they're not looking, when they break eye contact, because there's too much information coming in when you make eye contact. But this is a talk for another podcast.
Well, one thing I can add to that is one thing that I'm struck by is a lot of my adolescent clients, Casey, you may have been able to speak to this as well, is, this belief that there's only one trans narrative. There's only one trans narrative, that this is the story, this is how trans works, this is how non-binary works.
Right.
And just kind of getting clients to understand like diversity, the gender spectrum, and where you can be in the gender spectrum. And your journey is going to be very different from someone else's journey. And you may be neurodiverse and non-binary and lesbian. I mean, there's so many variations on this. And I love that you said biodiversity. I mean, it's so important to have biodiversity, right? To get a myriad of opinions.
Right.
Experiences.
Right. And it's so interesting because this is probably similar. I feel like there's a lot of parallels with our practices, because so much of our work is also to try to explain to like our parents what they, them might mean, or, there's just so many things that it's about explaining to the parents, like, gender expression is not the same as transitioning per se. It's like, if that's what your child's doing, don't freak out. It doesn't mean this.
Right.
It's like, okay, we're trying this on, but yeah, like I've had parents last night that it's like the they, them is still, pretty fresh and new for people. So.
Sure is.
Yeah.
So I've got another question for you. It's kind of related to what we were talking about, and this is going to be a two-parter, Laurie.
Okay.
Can you define what double minority is and how it impacts the transgender, gender diverse community? And can you also share about maybe unique challenges that are inherent in being gender diverse as well as neurodivergent?
Sure. So double minority status is the concept of a person who's experiencing two devalued identities. So in this particular case, it might be gender diverse and neurodiverse. And that the impact of each one of those minority statuses kind of compounds each other, so that the experience of the double minority and multiple minority status person is oftentimes much more trauma, experiences much more trauma, etc., than somebody who might only have, let's say, one of those identities. And so if you think about it, it's one thing, when you're transgender and that's your identity, and being able to kind of find your group of people, so other transgender people. But then if you're transgender and neurodiverse, it's kind of like, well, which community do I fit into? Am I in the, or let's just say autistic? Am I most comfortable in the autistic community? Am I most comfortable in the transgender community? Is there a community that comes together? And obviously that's going to be a smaller community then. And then let's say that you're Black, autistic, and trans, and then you have an even smaller and smaller. So it's hard. The more kind of minority statuses you present with or identify with, the more difficult it becomes to really find that place where you belong. And that you can be victimized, bullied, harassed for each one of those identities. And when you're 2, 3, or 4 of them, the amount of harassment and the lack of acceptance that you receive out there in the real world, it's just astronomical. And so I think it's just very important that people understand right off the bat how much more difficult it is to be autistic and gender diverse. Most people don't understand the autistic community, and they still think it's a bad thing, and I need to change you, and you need to act like you're not autistic. And we know many autistic people masked for years, so they tried to hide their autistic symptoms. They tried to not do some of the things that brought them pleasure. And it's the exact same thing with the gender diverse community. There's been a lot of masking and a lot of hiding and a lot of inauthenticity. So think about how that's compounded when you're trying to mask your autism and you're trying to mask your gender diversity. And so it's if you're a therapist, especially, just understanding that many of these clients that are walking in the door have a trauma background, maybe not the PTSD type of trauma, but just those years of being told, oh, you're autistic, you're broken. Oh, no, you're a boy, you can't wear those shoes. Oh, no, get a haircut. The negative messaging that has been given to these individuals pretty much throughout their lifetime, again, that's what's coming into the therapy room that really needs to be affirmed and needs to be worked on. Not the autism. We don't need to make you not autistic. Not the gender diverse piece, because we don't get to determine what your gender is, how you identify, how you express your gender. But understanding that these are people who have pretty much been devalued and demoralized for almost their entire lives.
Wow. And do you think that, this just popped into my head, but I'm curious, do you think there's a compounding factor to this, in that if someone has multiple marginalizations going on, that each one can't just be considered separately as a trauma, that one will compound on the other and compound on the other, and then kind of antagonize the one below it, and so it starts to compound? I wonder.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. It's definitely a compounding effect with each additional kind of, again, devalued identity. And so that's part of why it is so difficult. And it's one of the reasons too why what I started to say in the beginning was that you're finding your community. We all know how important finding your community is. And when you come from multiple minority statuses, it's, thank goodness for the internet, right? Because think about those people growing up before the internet who weren't able to log on to chat rooms and discover that there's all kinds of other autistic, gender diverse folk out there. What are the chances? Again, we live in LA, so we're kind of lucky because we live in this huge cosmopolitan place, but we have people, we have people coming from other countries where they cannot be out in their country. And the only place that they can be themselves is to come in. Like, even the autism isn't always fully accepted, but at least it's not as taboo as being transgender, gender diverse, or even queer. And so that's amazing that the internet exists, but we also need to think about there's a lot of people who didn't grow up with the internet, who grew up with these intersecting identities and felt completely alone and felt like they were wrong, that they were broken, that they did need to conform and change. And that is significant trauma.
Definitely. So as you're talking, I'm just so grateful to know about you and the help group and Kaleidoscope, because it just feels so helpful in the work that we do. And so the question I have for you is, how would a clinician with little or no experience working with neurodiverse and gender diverse persons formulate an affirming treatment plan?
That is a fantastic question. So one of the things that I think is very important, and I think I kind of alluded to it earlier, is certainly as a therapist, if you primarily work, let's say, with the gender diverse community, it is absolutely imperative that you start to get training and become autism informed. And so get out there and listen to the autistic voices, get on the internet and join some of the neurodiverse movement, pages and advocacy programs so that you can really learn about what autistic people need, so you can then be better informed when you're writing your goals and working with your client. And the same way, if you work with the autistic population, you really need to be doing research into the LGBTQIA community and identities and understanding the language. Autistic people are sensitive about the language that is used. So we've really moved back to person first. I'm an from the identity first. So it used to be that we would say person with autism, but autistic people have said, you know what, I'm that's who I am. I am an autistic person, and I'm not a person with autism. That kind of medicalizes it again, right? It makes it sound like I'm a person with diabetes. You don't really ever say you're a diabetic person. And because we're trying to move away from that medical diagnosis or medical thinking of autism, so that language has changed. And the language that you use within the LGBTQ community as a whole, but certainly the gender diverse community, like we were saying before, understanding the importance of pronouns, and understanding the importance of certain language, like not saying, come on, you guys, and just things that if you can do nothing else but make sure that when you're sitting with your clients, no matter how your client walks in the door, no matter what that client has said, I'm coming in because I'm anxious, that's fine, but ask them their pronouns, reveal your pronouns, ask them, what would you like to be referred to? Do you want me to use they, them pronouns with everybody? So I have clients, because my clients oftentimes are still children, I have clients who want me to write they, them in the notes. And when we're together to use they, them, but have asked me, like, if I go to an IEP meeting, to please still use, let's just say she, her pronouns, because they're not yet out. And so the ease that you can put a client at when they walk in the door and you just simply say, and what pronouns would you like me to use? And these are my pronouns. This is how I identify. It builds rapport almost instantly. And I know I've had so many clients who just say to me, thank you for asking that. Like, they're not expecting it. And it just really opens the door to let people know it's such an easy thing to do, right? And that's one of the most affirming things. I also really recommend that people always have, let's say, a flag or something like that in their office that just lets anybody walking in, or, if you're doing telehealth, kind of behind you, that lets people know that you are a safe space, that you understand. And then in terms of treatment goals, I'm very much into collaborative treatment goals, even when I work with children, because it's the child who has to do the work. So even when the parent says to me, I want him to learn blank, blank, and blank, I'll always say to my clients, well, what do you want to do? Because they are the ones that are going to have to do the work. But we'll oftentimes talk about, particularly with autism, I will state, I'm not here. My goal is not to make you not autistic. That's not what I'm going to do. And I will never talk like that. My goal is to make you feel more comfortable. So what are the things that we can do? What are the goals you want to work on? Typically, those are depression types of goals, anxiety reduction, some OCD, or certain, I want to learn to have better conversations. So a lot of my young adults will come in, I want to be a better friend. That's what I want to learn. It's like, that's fantastic. That's great. What are the things that you think, are stopping you from being the best friend that you want to be, etc. And we go from there. But I will just identify from the very beginning that reducing autistic symptoms would never be a goal.
Okay. It's interesting because I'm thinking again about the parallels, but how to tell a parent, for example, that didn't, that either were able to, like, that they were not diagnosed with autism, or, as a younger person, how to inform the parents, like, well, yeah, well, this is where we're at now, right? Like, why didn't the teachers figure it out in kindergarten? Or like, why is it now that my kids also struggling with gender and now this? Like, what, it's almost like, what's next? Like, what else? I mean, has that been hard to have to tell parents or explain to them that this is where their child is now? Because a lot of times parents will say to us, well, we didn't see the signs. They didn't show when they were young, like they were all femmy and this and that. I don't understand now why they want to be a boy or be non-binary. We didn't see it. Like, how did this happen? Like, is it just a phase or a fad that's going around?
Yeah.
How do you work with that, with families that are like, I didn't get it. What are you talking about?
Right. So there's a variety of different tacks to take on that. But one thing that I will say, again, kind of related to language, is I typically will say it's not that your child wants to be, it's that your child is. Or I realize it could be a young adult also, because there's a lot of autistic, gender diverse folk don't come out. They have to go through a double coming out process. So it's even, again, more difficult for them, because at some point they accept and come out as autistic, and at some point they accept and come out as gender diverse. And oftentimes parents will say, whichever one came first, I was okay with the gender diversity, but now you're telling me my child is also autistic. Like, that is too much, or vice versa. I was okay with the autism, but now you're telling me. And there's just a lot of psychoeducation that needs to go on with parents about what it means to be gender diverse, to be transgender, what a transition is, and how sometimes what the child is looking for. Particularly, I think also parents are very confused by non-binary presentations. Like, they'll say, what does that mean? How can my child be boy and girl, or not boy or girl? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And there's just a lot of psychoeducation that needs to go on. You need to sit down and talk about what does non-binary mean, and that, what does gender fluidity mean, and explaining that these things are true concepts, are real things, and that some people don't know their true identity until they're much older. We all know people who came out at 60.
Yep.
Right.
Clients who are in their 70s who are just coming out now. There's a whole amount of factors that go into feeling safe enough to come out. Socioeconomic and trauma and family history, like, name it, genetics.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when you add in the fact that for these autistic, gender diverse folk, they've most likely already come out once, and it's like, oh, now I have to do it again. And I think Grace, you had said in the beginning that that a lot of autistic gender diverse folks talk about, I think, what happens and what autistic gender diverse folk have reported to me with my clients, is that oftentimes when they're in certain LGBTQIA communities, that people will say, oh, wait a minute, if you're autistic, you're probably just confused, like, you're not really transgender. And there's a lot of invalidation even within the transgender or gender diverse community itself, because they don't understand autism. And there's this notion of, oh, well, then you're just confused. And again, my clients have really talked about how upsetting that is, because unless they're in a neurodiverse, gender diverse community, they don't feel fully accepted either way. They don't feel fully accepted in the autistic community, because they might not be aware of transgender issues, and vice versa. So think about, because it's not, I don't know that this is going to be grammatically correct, but it's not equally difficult, like saying, okay, well, it's difficult to be transgender, it's difficult to be autism. When we put them together, they compound. And there's, again, you've got the double masking and the double coming out, and the really unique experiences of this population. And the fact that both populations have trauma backgrounds.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I was just thinking at the end of the presentation, if or we can put it in the show notes, about books, specific books that our families could read or articles so that the parents can educate themselves as well.
We will include that in our show notes for sure.
Yeah, there's a couple of good books that I can recommend. So Finn Grattan and Ava Mendez have written fantastic books about the overlap.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
One other question that occurred to me, Laurie, as you were speaking is, and I've never used these terms before, but it just came into my head, active and passive marginalization. And that, passive marginalization is everyone needs a time to come out. Everyone needs a space to transition. Families need time to transition. It's like, the transgender, non-binary person, maybe the gender diverse person has, longer time experiencing themselves and have probably done years of research prior to ever walking into a therapy office.
Absolutely.
But the families may be just finding out for the first time and they need their time to transition. But it's interesting. I think there's a difference between that and like active marginalization, where you're actively saying to someone like, well, you're just confused.
Mm-hmm.
You can't be, I'm sure that your gender identity is just part and parcel with your autism spectrum disorder. That feels very active. That feels very aggressive to me.
Yeah. Yes.
Would you say that's true?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And there's, that's one of the things also that we will talk to parents about when they have, I'm going back to to a point that you made and what you were just saying. When a child comes out, or a young adult, so I'm using child just as an offspring, come out to a parent, let's say, we oftentimes will talk to the parents about the fact that this was a long time in coming. They didn't wake up that morning and say, hey, you know what? I'm transgender. It has been a long time of thinking and planning, and when am I going to say it, and how am I going to say it, and who am I going to come out to? And so just because the parents might not have noted the signs, it doesn't mean that the child hadn't been spending the past 2 years trying to figure out, what am I? What do I want to do? And also, my clients have had a lot of fluidity. So, for instance, I've had several clients who identified as gay before they identified as anything different about their gender, and now are non-binary or transgender, but started off just identifying. And for some of them, they were 10 years old at the time, and that was really what they understood. Yeah. Because I think this coming to terms sometimes with the fact that you might not be the gender that everybody keeps telling you you are, and that there isn't anything wrong with wanting to do non-traditional gender types of activities, dress, roles, etc., that there's nothing wrong with that. But I don't know that we're fully there as a society yet, because I watch TikTok all the time and just think, wow, okay, still have a long way to go.
There's still a lot of discrimination out there.
Well, there's a lot of just gender stereotyping, but I think people don't realize is complete gender stereotyping, and is making assumptions and putting odd societal beliefs onto children. Again, it's like, and it's that interesting, you look at all the little girls on TikTok always have the biggest possible bow in their hair, and they've always got pink Timberlands and all of this kind of stuff, and it's just like and so I was just thinking, it made me think of gender reveal parties, right? And I was like, don't get me started on that either. So yeah.
And to your point, I'm so grateful today that there's more of an understanding that gender and sexual orientation are different. Why should it be so hard for a kid who maybe comes out really young, even prepubescent, and says like, I like boys, and then and maybe they're assigned male at birth, but then maybe at 16 going, and my gender doesn't quite feel male, I feel female, or I want a more feminine presentation. It's such a shame that has to be a trauma that they have to experience, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think just the difference between like gender identity and gender expression is also very poorly understood. and that because assigned male at birth wears a dress doesn't make him transgender, doesn't make him a female. And that's still, it's such a hard concept for people to wrap their heads around.
Sure is.
Right. I try and do that with parents all the time. Like, just because your child is expressing themselves differently or painting their nails or whatever, doesn't mean this. Like,
Right.
we want to allow our kids to express themselves. And a lot of times parents get very upset about that. And I said, listen, if this is all they want to do right now, let's support it, because we all know the parental support and all of what the three of us are doing is so crucial to the mental health of the child. So yeah, there's just a lot. You're right. LA is kind of one area, but when I think about how red this country is too, come from all over the United States or the world to get help with you guys. I could understand that, because that kind of happens to us too, that we can't help everybody.
Right.
Certainly where our license is in California, but yeah, it's just so good to know that you guys are there. I mean, we could talk for hours, because then I'm thinking about IEPs and how you go into the schools and what accommodations are made, and like, because I have kids where you were talking about where it's like the sensory is just making them nuts and they want to wear headsets, and the parents are like, no. And it's like, what happens in an IEP? Is it then what are those accommodations, or like their clothes? It's just like, and I have kids that really want to be neurodiverse because they know it all, right? They says, I want to be, but my mom doesn't believe me.
Right.
So,
Right. Well, and it's interesting. I mean, obviously it's a whole nother conversation, but I will share the anecdote that Kaleidoscope had a table at the Pride Parade, at the WeHo Pride Parade. And as we were thinking about, what are the little things we want to give away and stuff like that, I thought, what about earplugs? Because it's a really loud event, but people want to be able to stay and be comfortable and celebrate. And we gave away every single pair of head and people, and I think I said headphones, like little earplugs, right? And one kid was an autistic trans young man, came up and said, it just started crying and said, you're the only people who get it. I can't believe that you have earplugs. But we thought, what would make this a more comfortable environment for our autistic, LGBTQ folk who want to be out there and show their pride, but it's too loud.
It's amazing.
Just can't underestimate being seen and heard and validated, right? I mean, is there anything better than that?
Yeah, no.
Is there, Grace?
Huh?
From our upbringings, probably all three of ours.
No, it's just like,
Yeah.
so healing.
Exactly. And again, just knowing that people out there get you. And it was such a simple thing. It was, it wasn't like, oh, we went out and bought, huge posters or something like that. It was just, and people would come by and say, wow, we can have these earplugs.
I'm laughing because of our swag. That has got to be something we have to include in our
100%.
swag.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's really quite smart that you do.
So smart. We've only got just a couple minutes, but there was one thing that occurred to me, Laurie, as you were speaking, unless there's something, Casey, you have that's pressing that you wanted to talk with Laurie about, but
hours.
I know I've got millions of questions, but the one that really struck me is, you talked about masking, and there's this confluence of kids and adolescents and teens and adults, for that matter, that are coming to terms with their gender identity, and there's a lot of pushback from cisgender heteronormative institutions about rapid onset gender dysphoria, and there's lots of commentators out there that are saying it's trending, and and that it's just a phase, and everything Casey mentioned earlier. But I wonder about the role of masking and how much that has played a part. And there's never been a space before for transgender, non-binary, gender diverse people to be themselves. There's never really been a space to be neurodivergent and to feel seen and heard and validated. So I really think it plays a big part, but I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
I think it plays a huge part. And again, I think it's so related to two of your identities have a history of being wrong and have a history of being something that needs to be cured. So, and they're truly just a part of you. It's how your brain was wired, and doesn't make you, like I said before, it doesn't make you something that needs to be cured. And we can't cure autism anyway. And then being gender diverse, non-binary, LGBTQ, the entire spectrum. And again, I used to be in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as homosexuality needed to be cured. And there are still, oh, we will convert you, to being quote unquote normal. So it's still happening. And so it makes sense that people are masking. And when you have that double minority identity, it might be, okay, well, I'm gonna let everybody know that I'm autistic, but I can't, like how Casey was saying, parents have such a hard time with this, oh, my child is autistic and gender diverse. The individual can have difficulty with that too, to say, well, I can't. I mean, how am I going to, and this has been so difficult and there's so much trauma. I don't want to come out as this either. And so trying to pretend that you are somebody that you aren't. And knowing that even when you do finally come out and say, I'm an autistic gender diverse person, that it's not like everybody's going to embrace you and say, so but that concept of masking is so strong in both populations. So the way that the amount of kind of suppressed anxiety, self-loathing, the messages that have been given to this population, these are the things that we're having to undo in therapy.
Yes. Yep. And addressing them all, and
Yeah.
yes, totally. Casey, any final comments from you for Laurie? Any questions or?
Oh, well, and I was just thinking about treatment as far as, because I think we're noticing it too, the difference between in person and doing it over telehealth. Do you notice that the clients prefer one over the other? Or because I know there's been studies, or they're going to do studies about the work we're doing, and is it as effective doing telehealth as being in person? And I just don't think it is. Especially with younger people, it's really been so helpful to just be with them. And if we're not going to sit, we'll plant something in my garden, or we'll take a walk, or I'll bring not a cat, but I'll bring the dog out. So it's sort of like, I don't know if you can just briefly comment. Maybe a lot of kids prefer doing it over telehealth. So what would you say?
So what I found to be, there's a couple of things that I found to be beneficial about telehealth with this population. So for many of my autistic clients, there's just an extreme anxiety in the commute there and back, because when you're kind of focused on time, or you don't have good time management and you have no idea where there's going to be traffic, and to get anywhere in Los Angeles, you can't get there in under 20 minutes, even if you're going next door. So you're adding layers to the therapy that when you take all of that out, the client is a little bit more relaxed and less, they're not worried about, oh, when am I going to get home and how am I going to have time to do this? They know exactly what time the session ends and when they can move on to their next thing. So that's been a bit beneficial. The other thing that has been beneficial for the gender diverse population is that not all of our clients are out to their families, but in their bedroom, they can, like, sometimes they'll say, you know what, I've got a skirt on. And
Nice.
mom and dad don't have to know, but they're able to do therapy presenting as who they want to present as. And so that has been very freeing for the population. I think when it comes to my preference for doing therapy, it's definitely in person.
Sure.
But those are the things that I have seen beneficial. And I know I love it when one of my clients, 13-year-old, leaned in and said,
Oh, that's
and
so
it was
great.
yeah, I mean, just
Oh,
and
my
the
heart.
elation. So that's what we were talking about the gender euphoria, right? Like this client was so euphoric, and it was, but would never have been able to wear a dress if I was seeing them in person.
Yep.
Or a skirt.
Great point.
Well, we want to thank our guest, Dr. Laurie Stephens, for joining us today. Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you for having me. It was a great discussion.
It was so amazing. For more information on the Help Group and Kaleidoscope LGBTQ, go to their websites, www.thehelpgroup.org and www.kaleidoscopelgbtq.org. For more information on gender wellness of Los Angeles, you can go to our website at genwell.org. Casey and I are also very pleased to announce the formulation of 2 new groups coming in January of 2023. Casey's group is going to be focusing on parents and caregivers of transgender and gender diverse youth, while mine will focus on trans and non-binary gender diverse adults over the age of 25. Space will be limited. They're going to be small therapy groups, 6 to 8 weeks in length. For more information on our groups, go to our website or contact Gender Wellness at 818-855-1105. And thank you for joining us today on Over the Binary, named as such because we are over the binary. Until that time, thanks.